December 5th, 1952. London, morning. A cold, still air mass settles over the city. No wind, no way for anything to escape upward. London's 4 million coal fires begin burning as they do every winter morning. Its factories pump smoke into the same still air. Its buses and lorries add diesel exhaust. The pollution that should have dispersed over the North Sea stays where it is. By evening, the visibility in central London is under a foot in places. People cannot see their own shoes. Conductors walk in front of buses carrying lanterns. Theater performances are abandoned midway through because the smog has crept inside. It stays for 4 days. When it finally clears on December 9th, the British government says the excess deaths were caused by influenza. There was no influenza epidemic. There was poison air, and between 4,000 and 12,000 people had breathed it long enough to die. The government knew the true scale within weeks. Internal civil service memos from December 1952 and January 1953 show clearly that officials understood a significant number of excess deaths had occurred. They show officials calculating how to present those numbers to avoid public panic and avoid political pressure to act against the coal industry. The coal industry was the backbone of British energy in 1952. Coal produced the electricity that powered the country. Coal heated the homes. Coal fueled the trains. Harold Macmillan, the housing minister, was dealing with a housing crisis that required cheap fuel. Acting against coal meant confronting an industry and a political dependency that the government was not ready to confront. So they called it fog. They said the winter had been hard. They suggested influenza. It took 4 years for the Clean Air Act to pass. 12,000 people were dead by then. One of them was a prize bull at the Smithfield Cattle Show, killed by the air in his stall within hours of the smog's arrival. 3 things about the Great London Smog that extend its story beyond 1952. The first, this was not the first time London's coal smoke had killed people at scale. A smog in 1948 had caused significant excess mortality. A smog in 1873 had been noted as particularly lethal. John Evelyn had published a pamphlet in 1661, 300 years before 1952, specifically warning the British government about coal smoke in London and its effects on health, and proposing that industries be moved away from the city centre. His recommendations were ignored. His pamphlet was largely forgotten. The smog of 1952 was not an unforeseen event. It was the predictable endpoint of 3 centuries of warnings. The second, the chemical composition of the 1952 smog was later analyzed in detail. It was not simply smoke and soot. It was sulfur dioxide from coal combustion, reacting with moisture in the air to form sulfuric acid particles, particles small enough to travel deep into one tissue. People who breathed the smog were breathing acid. Those with pre-existing respiratory or cardiac conditions were most vulnerable. But the analysis also found significant mortality among people with no prior health issues. The third, the death toll the government publicly acknowledged in 1952 was 4,000. The figure of 12,000 derived from detailed statistical analysis of excess mortality across London over the affected period was not publicly accepted by the British government for decades. It is still not universally cited in official British historical accounts of the disaster, which have tended to use lower estimates. In hospitals across London, the pattern of admissions over the first 2 to 3 days of the smog told a story that the government's public communications were actively working to obscure. Emergency respiratory admissions rose sharply. Cardiac events increased. The oxygen supplies of London's hospitals, already under pressure from normal winter demand, were consumed at a rate that required urgent requests for additional supplies. Medical staff working in wards where the smog had penetrated treated patients for acute bronchitis, pneumonia, and heart failure in numbers that had no parallel in recent winter records. London's undertakers and funeral directors were among the first non-medical sectors to grasp the scale of what was happening. By December 8th, the third day of the smog, several undertakers in central and east London had run out of coffins and were placing urgent orders. Florists in the areas of highest mortality had no flowers for funeral arrangements. The physical infrastructure of death was struggling to keep up with demand in a way that provided an irrefutable, commercially documented signal of elevated mortality that no government statement about influenza could entirely account for. The physical experience of the Great Smog has been described by survivors in terms that are consistently difficult to process for anyone who has only encountered ordinary fog or pollution. Visibility on some central London streets fell to effectively zero, not the few feet implied by the official accounts, but complete inability to see anything beyond arm's reach. A darkness in the middle of the afternoon that was also yellow-brown in quality, rather than the clean gray of normal fog, and that carried a distinct, acrid smell that irritated the eyes and throat immediately upon stepping outside. The smog penetrated buildings through gaps around windows and doors, filling interiors with a haze visible in indoor lighting. Hospital staff treated patients in wards that smelled of it. Shopkeepers worked in it. People ate meals in it. London's transportation systems responded with varying degrees of failure. The underground continued running because the trains moved through sealed tunnels, but travelers above ground often could not find the entrances to stations at normal walking distances. Bus services attempted to continue, in many cases with conductors walking ahead of moving vehicles with lanterns to check for obstacles, a system that reduced speeds to roughly walking pace. River traffic on the Thames was suspended almost entirely for much of the event. The Smithfield Meat and Livestock Show was taking place at Earl's Court during the smog's worst days. Cattle that had been transported from farms across the country to compete in the show began showing signs of respiratory distress within hours of the smog's onset. Prize animals, representing years of breeding and thousands of pounds in value, died in their stalls despite every effort by handlers and veterinarians. The speed and severity of death in cattle, animals with larger lung capacity and no pre-existing health conditions, provided a stark, immediate illustration of the smog's chemical lethality. The death rate in London during the first week of December 1952 was, by all subsequent analysis, dramatically elevated compared to historical norms for that time of year. London's hospitals were overwhelmed within the first 2 days. Florists reported running out of flowers for funerals. Coffin makers ran short of materials. Undertakers could not keep up with demand. Harold Macmillan's correspondence with colleagues during the period shows a minister fully aware of the scale of the problem and fully focused on minimizing the political implications. His famous remark in a private memo suggesting that nobody should rush to do anything about the smog until at least 3 or 4 weeks had passed, to allow the immediate public reaction to subside, captures a political calculation that prioritized the interests of the coal industry and the government's legislative agenda over the evidence of mass preventable death that was accumulating in London's death registers. The 4-year gap between the December 1952 smog and the Clean Air Act of 1956 was filled with committee reports, industry consultations, and parliamentary debates in which the government consistently argued that the evidence was complex, that multiple factors contributed to the elevated mortality. and that drastic action against coal burning needed to be weighed against economic consequences. These were not entirely disingenuous arguments. The coal industry did matter. The economic consequences were real. The problem was that 12,000 people had already died waiting for the calculation to reach a conclusion. The government's response over the days and weeks that followed was shaped almost entirely by a calculation about what the public could be told without generating pressure for immediate expensive action. Internal documents show civil servants drafting language specifically designed to attribute excess deaths to respiratory illness and the cold winter rather than to the smog itself, while privately acknowledging among themselves that the pollution had been the primary cause. Harold Macmillan's department, which had responsibility for housing and fuel policy, was particularly resistant to any public acknowledgement of the smog's lethality, because any such acknowledgement would immediately raise the question of what the government intended to do about domestic coal burning, a question with no comfortable answer. The Clean Air Act, passed in 1956, 4 years after the smog, was the eventual legislative response. It restricted the burning of coal in certain urban areas, created smoke-free zones in major cities, and began the gradual transition of British domestic heating away from open coal fires. The legislation was significant, and its long-term effects on British air quality were real and measurable. It came 4 years after an event that killed thousands of people in a single week, in a crisis whose severity the government had worked to minimize in public, while acknowledging it internally. The gap between 12,000 excess deaths and the government's preferred figure of 4,000 deaths represents not a dispute between equally uncertain estimates, but a documented pattern of political calculation. The 4,000 figure suited the narrative of a bad winter with elevated natural mortality. The 12,000 figure implied a specific, foreseeable, preventable catastrophe caused by the deliberate burning of a fuel the government was unwilling to restrict. Modern air quality science has revisited the 1952 smog extensively, and the resulting research has provided important data on the long-term health effects of particulate air pollution of the type generated by coal combustion. Epidemiological studies of populations exposed to the 1952 event have tracked health outcomes for decades, finding elevated rates of respiratory and cardiovascular disease in affected populations that persisted long after the smog itself cleared. The physicality of the smog's residue was immediate and visible. London's buildings, already darkened by decades of coal smoke, were noticeably further blackened by the December 1952 event. The cleaning of London's landmark buildings that began in the following decades revealed original stonework and colors that many Londoners had simply never seen. Hidden under layers of soot accumulated over the same period that public health officials had been insisting the coal smoke was manageable. There is no specific memorial to the victims of the 1952 Great Smog. There is no annual commemoration. The event is discussed in environmental history and public health contexts. It is taught in relation to the Clean Air Act and to air quality regulation. The 12,000 individual people who died of breathing London's air in 4 December days do not have a monument in any London park or public square. The 1952 smog sits at the intersection of several longer histories. A 3-century history of London's coal smoke problem that John Evelyn identified in 1661. The political history of the British coal industry and its relationship with successive governments, and the medical and epidemiological history of understanding what particulate air pollution does to human tissue. It is an event that is fully explained by all 3 of those histories simultaneously. The tragedy was not that nobody understood what coal smoke did. It was that the people with the power to act had too many reasons not to act, and so they waited. They waited 4 years, and then they passed the Clean Air Act when the public pressure finally exceeded the political cost of inaction. If you want to understand the disasters where governments knew the death toll and chose the number that was most politically convenient, subscribe. Every week a story that was hidden in plain sight.